Hello, sisters. Lesbian Psychologies, Explorations and Challenges, edited by the best Boston Lesbian Psychologies Collective. Part 4, Therapies. Essay number 13. Internalized Homophobia, Identifying and Treating the Oppressor Within, by Liz Margolies, Martha Becker, and Karla Jackson-Brewer. In the last 15 years, the gay rights movement increased the awareness of the intensity of social intolerance of homosexual men and women. A review of the literature reveals numerous articles addressing this oppression, homophobia, as a social phenomenon, the response of homosexuals to a prejudiced environment, or homophobic beliefs of psychotherapists. However, there is a dearth of material concerning the process by which minority victimization affects internal processes and a sense of self. In our work with lesbian clients, we have been confronted regularly with the insidious and limiting effects of this internalized homophobia has on their lives. We explore here, for the benefit of clinicians and other readers, the relationship between the reality of homophobic culture and the impairing identity, impaired identity of lesbians and gay men. We will not address the etiology of homosexuality, which we consider a normal variation in the sexual/affectional object choice. We propose both a conceptual model of and a treatment approach to internalized homophobia. The model provides a structural definition for understanding and identifying the homophobic feelings and behaviors. The treatment approach, developed from classical psychoanalytic thought, offers a reliable set of clinical tools to facilitate working through these defenses. As an example of the therapeutic approach, we will discuss the case of one client. The term homophobia was first coined in 1973 by George Greenberg, who described the irrational fear, hatred, and intolerance of homosexual men and women. We consider the opposite of an intrapsychic homophobia to be a feeling that one's homosexuality is egosyntonic and integrated into one's whole self. Homophobia functions on a social plane as well as internally as a defense mechanism. Culturally, it is a belief system that justifies discrimination based on sexual orientation. Gordon Allport claims the social prejudices developed out of the natural tendency to overgeneralize and oversimplify the complexities of the world. According to Allport, this kind of prejudice is acted out in 3 stages, each more oppressive than the last: anti antilocution, offensive language, discrimination, and violence. Homosexuals experience these as name calling, denial of equal opportunity in the military, adoption proceedings and employment, and quote unquote queer bashing. Internally, homophobia is the negative adoption and acceptance within a lesbian or a gay man of these negative attitudes. The oppressive and prejudiced environment takes root, feeding on histories, issues, and the unique social conditions of each individual. This internal oppressor cannot be identified, reevaluated, or worked through without first clearly understanding the role of social deviance and the reality of its danger to the individual. Damian Martin has argued that homosexuals comprise a minority group in this culture because they fit Allport's definition that the group suffers unjustified negative acts from the environment. Allport goes on to identify certain minority group character traits resulting from the group's victimization. The list includes obsessive concern with the group stigma, denial of membership, withdrawal, passivity, aggression against one's own group, and identification with the dominant group, self-hate. These traits, seen in many homosexuals, Jews, blacks, and Hispanics, became the basis of the oppressor within. Homosexuals have some unique features as a group. Unlike blacks and Jews, for example, homosexuals do not have a group identity from birth, and therefore, the family does not provide the first role model and support system. In addition, blacks and Jews have churches, temples, and social institutions that provide sources of protection not available to homosexuals. A second critical difference between homosexuals and other minority groups is that the fact of homosexuality is not always visible to others. The lack of visibility permits individuals the option of denying membership publicly. The ability to quote unquote pass means that there will always be a discrepancy between the number of publicly labeled quote unquote deviants and the total number of lesbians and gay men. However, regardless of visibility, most homosexuals are viewed by mainstream society as sexual perverts, criminal, a danger to children, and psychologically disturbed. Alice Moses believes that if an individual is aware of the societal reaction to group members and can identify as one of the minority, it is likely that the individual will self label. Kenneth Plummer claims that the consequences of labeling can be the same whether the stigma is socially or self assigned. A self labeled lesbian, for example, may be quote unquote passing as a heterosexual, but she often will experience the identical internal reaction of her quote unquote out counterpart. She may fear and expect the public experiences of prejudice, which are overtly or covertly threatening to lesbians in this culture. In other ways, a hidden lesbian may have a more difficult time. Moses has pointed out that in order to maintain a public impression as a non deviant, a lesbian must learn how to be extra sensitive to the common sense understandings and behaviors of quote unquote normal people. What is taken for granted by the dominant culture must be well rehearsed by the lesbian who desires to pass. The risk of exposure is present daily. The hidden lesbian may also lose sight of the differences between her private and public self. She is isolated from her peers, and she knows always that the acceptance by the approved group is based on a lie. Weinberg claims that the amount of damage to the self caused by such a lie is directly proportional to the amount of self contempt that motivated the lie. In other words, passing can be motivated either by an accurate perception of a potentially dangerous situation or by internalized homophobia. Internalized homophobia is expressed in a variety of ways. Some are quite obvious. For example, quote, I hate myself for being a lesbian, end quote. The more, the more covert and insidious forms are less easy to identify and are often expressions of unconscious homophobia and are, in fact, defense mechanisms. If the therapist does not recognize these expressions, feelings, and behaviors, the treatment will have serious limitations. Clearly, no progress can be made unless the therapist has recognized her own internalized homophobia. The following is a beginning list of some of these less obvious expressions and their underlying defenses. 1. Fear of discovery. Although such fear is generated by a need to protect oneself from possible rejection, it is sometimes expressed as the need to protect others from the knowledge of one's own homosexuality. Statements like, quote, it will kill them, end quote, or, quote, we don't talk about my personal life, so there's no need to bring it up, end quote, express this fear and exhibit the self defense mechanisms of projection and rationalization. 2. Discomfort with obvious fags and dykes. The quote unquote bull dyke, as the unembarrassed embodiment of how different lesbians are, evokes public scorn and condemnation that a more quote unquote normal looking lesbian believes she doesn't deserve. A lesbian who tries to pass will fear that association with more obvious homosexual types will give away her true identity. This belief and behavior are examples of the defense mechanism of identification with the aggressor. 3. Rejection slash denigration of all heterosexuals, heterophobia. This is a homophobic response to reverse discrimination. When a lesbian's homosexuality is ego-systonic, she doesn't require anyone to share her values and lifestyle. Projection is the defense at work here. 4. Feeling superior to heterosexuals. This form of homophobia is an exaggerated gay pride, a false embracing of differentness. It can be expressed as, quote, we are better because we have a harder life, end quote, or, quote, our lives are more interesting, freer, more artistic, less encumbered, end quote, or, quote, we are better because we don't have to deal with men, end quote. These statements are often voiced by the lesbian community when a member decides to relate sexually to a man. The feelings and statements reflect the use of rationalization and reaction formation. 5. Belief that lesbians are not different from heterosexual women. This belief rationalizes and minimizes a true difference in an attempt to avoid discrimination, homophobia, from others. It denies the social, political, and sexual context within which lesbian relationships struggle for existence. This can be expressed as, quote, relationships are all the same, mine just happens to be with another woman, end quote. Or, quote, what we do in our bed doesn't define us, end quote. This is a rationalization and denial. 6. An uneasiness with the idea of children being raised in a lesbian home. This idea is often expressed as, quote, I think artificial insemination is too deviant, end quote, or, quote, I believe children need to have a male parent, end quote. These statements deny the reality that many children are raised by single mothers, and also demean the validity of the lesbian relationship. It is like saying, quote, it's okay for me to be a lesbian, but I wouldn't want my daughter to marry one, end quote. This employs the defense mechanisms of identification with the aggressor. 7. Restricting attractions to unavailable women, heterosexuals, or those already partnered. These attractions, which never lead to a fully committed relationship, are a way of restraining full expression of one's lesbianism. We will elaborate on this in a case presentation. Denial is the defense. 8. 8. Short-term relationships. Issues of intimacy, trust, and merging notwithstanding. Short-term relationships require less of a commitment to one's lesbianism. Living with a lover involves greater social risks and stigma than having a casual, quote-unquote, dating relationship. Commitment brings with it decisions about public rituals, for example, Thanksgiving with the family, or the office Christmas party. Rationalizations and denial are the defenses. For homosexuals, internalized homophobia consists of two distinct forces: erotophobia, fear or discomfort with one's own sexuality, and xenophobia, discomfort with one's own strangeness. To live fully as a lesbian is a challenge to be both sexual and different. The weight of these two forces exists within each individual, side by side, playing against each other. Xenophobia is experienced as a fear of parental and social rejection based on differentness from perceived expectations, as an internal conflict is grounded within the family. The fear of being unacceptable to one's family, the fear of rejection and expulsion, leads to powerful self-hate. The superego serves as the repository for social/familial rules. Tampering with established patterns is often accompanied by shame, guilt, fear, and anxiety. It is not necessary to come out to experience xenophobia. It is an internal process based on a projected response as quote unquote weirdos, quote unquote freaks, quote unquote outlaws, quote unquote deviants, and quote unquote aliens, lesbians do not fulfill parental dreams, thereby losing the quote unquote good girl status that their parents or other or society's eyes, and therefore their own self esteem. Mourning this loss is an important stage in the therapeutic process. The homophobic tendency is either to deny difference or to deny caring about the difference. Erotophobia, being uncomfortable with forthright sexual expression, is not limited to lesbians or gay men. Ours is a culture dealing with the paradox of pervasive sexual imagery and deep seated sexual repression. All children are raised with sex guilt. In addition, women have historically equated sex with danger, and fear of unwanted pregnancy, rape, and venereal disease. In the media and popular culture, the openly sexual woman is considered a prostitute, whore, tease, and a quote unquote bad girl. Unlike heterosexuals, the lesbian has a total separation of sex from procreation, the one acceptable sexual function. With no courtship rituals or wifely duty to hide behind, lesbian sex is purely for pleasure. One of our society's homophobic distortions is therefore to see the lesbian only as sexual, which exacerbates her internalized erotophobia. When a lesbian comes out to her parents, or even considers doing so, the discussion is often the first family acknowledgement that she is a sexual being. Bringing home a lover reminds or announces to the parents that the two have sex. Love and romance take a back seat to the sexual aspects of the relationship. Research studies have shown that people with more negative attitudes toward heterosexuals express more rigidity and guilt toward their own sexual impulses. They perceive gay men and women as more expressive of sexual impulses. Oppressed minority groups are often seen as more sexual. This may reflect some envy by the dominant group. For example, blacks may be considered hypersexual, Druze, Jews sexually exotic, and women insatiable. Consciousness raising and political action groups have had major impact on identifying social and institutional forms of homophobia. They contribute to a more positive self image for group members by placing the oppressive enemy outside the self, validating the feelings and experiences of individuals, breaking down personal isolation, and supporting the alternative lifestyle. The more deeply internalized forms of homophobia, those without clear political sources, are rarely reached by these external activities. These untouched forms are often left unnamed, denied, or deemed unacceptable. When feelings are not afforded room for conscious expression, they are repressed and acted out instead. Consequently, when consciousness raising or radical politics make the homophobia unacceptable, the internal forms become more subtle and insidious. For example, the concept of quote unquote political correctness in the lesbian community has mythologized appropriate feelings and ideas about lesbianism. The subculture, acting as family, replaces the larger social order as an extender of homophobia. The unacceptable impulses and effects then become hidden and distorted. In other words, while the macroculture encourages the lesbian to feel only shame, the subculture pushes an abractive pride. A rich and full experience of homosexuality must include the opportunity to question, doubt, and explore all aspects of being a lesbian in this culture. The particular focuses and freedoms of therapy offer greater access to internalized homophobia, with fewer restrictions on expression. The therapeutic milieu and the relationship between client and therapist afford a unique opportunity to search below the social surface of homophobia. The treatment approach evolves from a contextual understanding of lesbianism and the unique experiences and ego strengths of each woman. Clients rarely seek therapy to help with self labeled internalized homophobia. Their homophobia is most often expressed in conjunction with other issues and remains embedded in a wide range of experiences. A number of studies have attempted to find significant psychological differences between lesbians and heterosexual women. Their results have varied widely. However, the majority of those that use non client populations discovered no significant differences in psychopathology and self esteem. A recent study by Ronald Latour and Christina Vandenberg confirmed a previously tested conclusion that, with the exception of erotic preference, homosexual and heterosexual women possess many of the same psychological characteristics. While studies of the limiting and deleterious effects of internalized homophobia have not been conducted, it is assumed that the homosexual burden of living in a hostile environment would produce some discernible differences between lesbian and heterosexual psychological profiles. This, then, needs to be the primary variable in developing a distinct treatment methodology for lesbians and gay men. Internalized homophobia functions as a defense mechanism resulting from the ego struggle between rules and desires. Rather than a single entity, internalized homophobia is comprised of a constellation of defense methods, allowing for individual variations. The cluster usually includes rationalization, denial, projection, and identification with the aggressor. Similarly, Freud cited introjection and identification and projection as the tools employed to deal with unacceptable homosexual impulses and labeled them neurotic mechanisms. It is the therapist's role to facilitate the differentiation between the pathological uses of these defense strategies and the healthy functions. When is the homophobia based on irrational, unfounded, or obsolete fears? And when is it a management defense and ego, sorry, when is it a management defense the ego employs to cope with a hostile or ego alien environment? Concurrently, therapeutic interventions must include an evaluation of the internal price of the defense, for example, the hiding, lack of intimacy, and sexual rigidity. Anna Freud explained defense mechanisms as the techniques the ego makes use of to protect itself against unendurable or painful ideas, drives, and effects. Anxiety can be in the form of objective anxiety, superego anxiety, and id anxiety. The ego struggles to warn off both unacceptable drives and the effects associated with the prohibited impulses. Objective anxiety is developmentally a precursor to a child's superego. It is the internal representative of outside powers, a quote unquote forepain, that governs the ego's behavior. The anticipation of suffering that may be inflicted on the child by outside agents has ramifications, whether or not the expected punishment always or even actually takes place. In adulthood, objective anxiety is the reality of an internalized homophobic culture. In homophobia, id anxiety is triggered by homosexual sex, erotophobia, and the ego anxiety is a result of social deviance, xenophobia. Sexual impulses enter consciousness and seek gratification. Developmentally, once the ego is separated from the id, it views these demands more hostilely. The ego fears the superego, setting up an ideal standard demanding degrees of sexual remuneration. When it is the dread of the outside world or dread of the superego, it is the anxiety that sets the defense in motion. The political lesbian has an additional form of superego anxiety. A second ideal standard of adamant pride in one's lesbianism causes new anxieties for the ego. The ego also wards off effects associated with the prohibited impulses. Whereas impulse gratification is always something pleasurable, effects may be either pleasurable or painful. The tendency to resist an effect may be greatest when it is distressing. With homophobia, the pain, longing, and mourning associated with living an unacceptable lifestyle become defended against. After the therapist and client recognizes the homophobia, the primary treatment goal is to reconcile the conflicting pulls between sexual impulse and shame or guilt. The ego must learn to gratify the id without discriminations from the superego. The internal battle needs to be exposed and a truce drawn up. A secondary goal is to help clients experience their sexual choices as ego syntonic. Neither denying nor clinging to a lesbian identity allows the fullest range of choices concerning living in this culture as a free sexual being. This involves observing and working through homophobic beliefs, feelings, and behaviors. This treatment approach is fluid enough to allow for compatibility with a range of therapeutic styles. These strategies will be most effective with clients with more intact egos. The approach, based on therapeutic work at a cognitive level, has its limitations in applicability for borderline and psychotic disturbances. Those patients are less able to make use of the relationship with the therapist or to develop intimate romantic partnerships with members of either sex. Mm. Objective anxiety can be revealed by the exposing and exploring of conscious and unconscious fantasies. The cognitive structures of the client's ego are engaged to re examine the old fears. The present day accuracy of the homophobic fantasies is evaluated for signs of exaggeration, crudeness, distortion, and obsolescence. The therapist at this stage can question whether realistic difficulties are being used as a cover for other, more deep seated fears and anxieties. Id and superego anxiety are tapped by focusing discussion in therapy on the client's erotophobia and xenophobia. Therapists should encourage clients to deal with their family's responses to their lesbianism, whether real or imagined. They should direct discussions also to the resistance to forthright sexual expression. Therapy is a passage back into consciousness of the superego demands and the distorted or prohibited id impulses. Finally, therapists should help create room in their egos for both the effects associated with the prohibited impulses and the more conscious feelings associated with choosing a life to live an alternative lifestyle. Clients need to discover and express discomfort, doubt, mourning, and fear, as well as pride and delight. It is a myth of lesbian politics that the healthy lesbian does not have these feelings. Such dogma encourages the twisting or denying of feelings that are appropriate to living a minority group existence in a hostile environment. The byproduct of this phase of treatment is often outwardly directed anger. As self directed anger, shame, and identification with the oppressor are expressed and released, clients are more able to see the cultural expressions of homophobia and feel a righteous anger and indignation. The role of the therapist in this work is crucial. The transference relationship can be examined in terms of projected fears and criticisms. What feelings or behaviors does the client perceive as unacceptable to the therapist? How does this vary if the therapist is heterosexual or homosexual? A positive working relationship can be the client's first building block of a support system. Clients internalize the acceptance of the therapist, an acceptance that acknowledges sexuality, differentness, fears, doubts, and pride. This internalization can facilitate fuller expressions of lesbianism in the outside world by reducing projection of unfounded negative attitudes. Therapists also serve as role models. Although it is certainly controversial to consider coming out to clients, Morin and Garfinkel have suggested that a crucial experience in changing homophobic attitudes is close personal interaction with gays of similar social status. A successful, proud, competent lesbian therapist can pass this possibility on to her clients. Although some lesbian therapists are not in a position to be out in their jobs, they need to question if or how their own homophobia may play a role in this decision. Similarly, the choice of when or if to come out to clients needs to be examined in terms of individual treatment issues. Too often, therapists' internalized homophobia contaminates this treatment rationale. The internalized homophobia of both lesbians and heterosexual therapists will have transferential encounter consequences. Rand, Graham, and Rawling cite research that shows the most significant role of the lesbian community is to validate members' self esteem. Their own study confirmed that psychological health is positively correlated with appropriate and selective self disclosure, as well as frequency of contact with the lesbian community. Therefore, it becomes incumbent upon therapists to support and encourage clients' participation in lesbian groupings with referrals to community resources when necessary. A case example will illustrate the issues and techniques. Karen, 26, is from a white, lower middle class family. She is the second oldest of six children. Her parents were divorced when she was 17. Her relationship with her father has always been positive and nurturing, whereas that with her mother was distant, critical, and conflicted. Karen moved to New York to be closer to her older sister. This sister, always considered the quote unquote bad girl in the family, was living at the time with her lesbian lover. Although her older sister was often in trouble, Karen was her father's proclaimed favorite. At the time that Karen entered therapy, she stated that she wanted to deal with career and family issues. She had spent the summer going back and forth between her mother's and father's homes and was feeling torn and confused. Her professional aspirations were in music. However, she had spent 2 years in New York as a daycare teacher and was feeling unfulfilled. During this first session, Karen also stated confusion about her sexuality. Karen did not identify herself as gay, straight, or bisexual, although she had never had a relationship with a man. She had been sexually involved with one woman throughout high school and two women during college. Since coming to New York, Karen had had a crush on a woman already in a lesbian relationship, followed by a futile courtship with a woman who was quote unquote confused about her sexual orientation. As treatment began, Karen was quote unquote in love with her married supervisor. After 6 months of individual therapy, it was suggested that her treatment be supplemented by weekly group sessions. After several weeks in group, and in the context of telling another story, she inadvertently revealed that she had been sexual with a woman. She reported in her next individual session, quote, I left the group, and all the next day I couldn't believe that I had told them. I walked down the street and heard myself saying over and over, I can't be gay, I can't be gay. I just can't handle how people react to it, how my father would react to it. I asked myself, if I could have my wish, what would it be? To be straight or to feel good about being gay? And I chose being straight. Instantly, I responded to myself, but I am gay. As I looked up, I saw two straight women come out of the store in front of me. They were talking to each other about makeup, and I said to myself, I'm not straight. I'm not one of them. I feel so much shame for how I felt about Mary, guilt and shame. Even she told me I wasn't gay, that we'd both outgrow it. I look at both of my lovers, and they're married now. And I look at me and say, where am I? I know I feel less shame when I love someone who doesn't love me back. It's not as real. End quote. In Karen's case, the xenophobia was a more potent force than her erotophobia, although the two always operate in tandem. During the course of treatment, she examined her various fantasies of how her lesbianism would literally kill her father. Through this process, Karen was able to understand how she had always felt pressure to be the quote unquote good girl to compensate for the pain of her sister's behavior. Sorry, to compensate for the pain her sister's behavior inflicted on the father. This resulted in a release of previously internalized anger at her sister. Building from the support and acceptance she experienced within the therapeutic relationship, Karen was encouraged to explore what it meant to her that she was not what her father hoped she would be. Although she was still passing as the good girl, she was not heterosexual and never wanted to have children for her father to grandfather. Her hiding permitted him to continue his expectations, although Karen always knew his perceptions were based on a lie. Karen cried and mourned the loss of the imaginary perfect relationship with her father. Finally, Karen had to deal with the fact that she was different in the context of the larger world. She was soft spoken and dressed in dark conservative clothes. She had never liked attention drawn to her, never strived to be noticed or unique. In a classically xenophobic style, she aspired to sameness. She discovered and expressed through therapy the fears and discomfort that surrounded her choice of an alternative lifestyle. Karen's erotophobia was expressed in a variety of ways. She could make love to her partners but had difficulty allowing them to reciprocate. Similarly, Her attraction to unavailable women, for example, a nun, allowed her the romantic component of a relationship without the sexual commitment to lesbianism. Therapy brought these issues to light and connected them with her internalized homophobia. During this period, Karen began dating a woman. Within the context of this relationship, she experimented with her sexuality and was freed to experience sexual pleasure. Positive feelings about herself and her relationship helped Karen develop some of what may be called quote unquote gay pride. Identifying more as a lesbian, she began to feel some righteous anger and indignation at the ways she and her lover were treated. This was an acknowledgement of the homophobic culture. Although Karen may be unusual in her degree of psychological health, the potential success of treatment methodology is not exceptional. The application of the concepts of erotophobia and xenophobia has proven to be both direct and efficient in working through internalized homophobia. Results have been archived with a variety of clients and clinical styles. Because homophobia is a reflection of the way in which society views homosexuality, the, nat- the nature of homophobia may change over time with society's changing attitudes towards sex and difference. Other areas for further investigation include an exploration of how internalized homophobia is both different from and similar to other internalized oppressions and the interactions of multiple internalized oppressions. This chapter provides a possible framework for future examination.